Alright, so in this video we're going to make a really simple one-page HTML document that connects to a really simple database. We're not going to do any front-end frameworks like React or Vue or anything else that you might have heard of like that, although that is really going to be your next steps for making more complicated web apps that use databases. But for today we're just going to keep it real simple. This is kind of an introductory video to just getting some data that you might enter into a field like this from a simple HTML web page and getting it put to an external database so that you can store that data more permanently and update or remove or find or query that data from the database as well. So it's going to end up looking something like this, where we can do something like type in an ID for the bit of data that we want. We can type in a name. I'll just use my name, like Mr. Patterson, and then the person's age, so I'm obviously 21, and we just click insert and it adds the data to our external database. Then if we want to find that person, we can enter the ID of that bit of data and it just pops up into our actual web page the name and the age. We can also change our mind on what their name is. Maybe I'm actually James, and we can update that data. And then if I were to refresh and to search by ID for that data entry, it now has updated that with James. Or I can take that same ID and I can actually remove it completely from my database, which means that if I were to search for it again by the ID number, it would come up blank and say no data found. So that's what we're aiming for. We're aiming to create a simple web page that allows us to insert, update, and remove and find data from an external database that we've connected to our HTML. So let's get started. First thing is you want to actually use Firebase. I'm going to suggest we use this as a nice simple database to get started with, and it's run by Google, and they do a lot of stuff that actually makes things nice and easy for us. So if you're coming in for the first time and you just search for Firebase, you will come across something like this and it'll ask you to sign up. I'm not going to teach you how to sign up and create an account because I'm sure you can do that, but then you go to the console of your own account and you can create a project and you just give it a name. So I'm just going to call this one video demo because that's what I'm doing. And we're not going to worry about analytics or anything fancy like that just now. This is just to get something simple started. We're going to create a project. And then once that's ready, we just click continue. And now we have our project up and running, but we don't have a database yet. So we're going to come to build, and we're going to actually build our database for this project. So I'm going to use a real-time database for this demo. And we're just going to click create database. And we need to select the closest sort of data store to where we are. So for me, that's Singapore. I just click next. And I want to start this in test mode because that keeps it nice and open just for testing out. You probably want to use higher security rules for if you're doing something for real, but for demo purposes and for just getting something started, and I'm going to delete this as soon as I've done the video, we're going to have a test mode just to make sure that it works straight away for us. And click enable. Okay, and now we have a space where our data can actually go. So inside of our project, this is the actual database itself, and this is where our data is going to be stored. Just very quickly, the rules include a cutoff date for when this database won't actually work anymore. So if you've tried and it stops working, that's the sort of date that it's going to be doomed to not work anymore. Of course, you can change it, but that's one of the things about test mode. Okay, so now that we have our database, what we're going to do is actually come to our project settings. And in the project settings, this is where we can actually create an app or find code for an app that actually allows us to connect to. Now, we're not going to do mobile, Android or Apple today. We're going to use a web app. So we're going to use HTML. There's our familiar HTML brackets. We'll create our web app. And I prefer to just call it exactly the same name, video demo, as I have for the project. For me, I just find that easier. We don't need to worry about hosting. So I'm just going to click register app. And once it's registered, it actually gives us a piece of code that we can use to connect to our HTML. So that's really useful. I'm not going to use this just now. I'm going to go continue to console because I want to emphasize that we can find this with the project settings. The project settings for our project, we can scroll down and this is where the code is going to be found. Now we're going to want to use the CDN here, and this CDN, you can see we've got script tags here, and these script tags allow us literally just to copy and paste the code into our HTML document to allow us to make that connection between the HTML web page and our actual database. Now for those of you that are lazy, in the description of the video I've put a link to my GitHub repository where all the code for the video is going to be. So all the code that we're about to do together in this video, I've put it here. I highly recommend that you don't just copy and paste this because for a start it's not going to work straight away. There's things that need to be done. But secondly, if you then want to go and modify this code and make it your own and make it work for you, it's going to be very tricky to do that if you don't actually understand what all this code is doing. But more importantly, it's not going to work unless you actually put the right code in this part here. You can see this is comments at this point, so it's not going to work as it is. But what you will put in here is more or less going to be the code that you've got from the app that you've set up in Firebase for your database. Okay, and during the video I'll show you exactly how to do that. But for now, let's get started. Let's create some code. So I'm going to go to Visual Studio Code here, and I'm going to create a new text file, and I'm just going to save this one on the desktop, and I'll call it my simple database. Now .html, never forget the .html. Okay, so there's our HTML document, and I'm going to use the exclamation mark and tab to autocomplete and get that nice boilerplate code started for us. So let's give it a title as well. I'll just call it my simple database again. Oops. My simple database. So I'm going to make a couple of divs. That's how I'm going to start. So a div here and a div here, and each of these divs do different things. So the first div is going to be where I enter the details of the person's name or age or whatever. So I'll give that an ID. We'll give each div a name. So I'm just going to call this one enter details, because it means that I can actually find this element from my HTML later, and I'm going to want to do things with either the styling or the JavaScript with different elements from my HTML. So it's important that I give the essential elements a name. So I'm going to call this one find details because this is where I'm going to do my querying. In that second div, I'm going to find or query the database at that point. So firstly, let's just make it clear to the user what we're doing here. So I'll just make a heading for each one. This one is the enter details space. So I'll call it enter details. And then I'll grab something similar for the find details, but I'll just call it find. And I'm going to ask people to find by a particular ID number. So we're going to give each entry into this database a particular ID. Okay, so underneath our H1s, we want to have headings. I might make these H4s, headings for the type of data we want to put in. So we're going to start with an ID number for each separate piece of data. When we're dealing with names, you might have like 5 Johns, for example, but if they've each got their own unique ID, then it means that we can query the database and know which John exactly we're talking about. So it's really useful in the database for each data entry to have its own separate ID. Okay, and then there needs to be a space for people to actually type in, this ID number. So we're going to put an input field in there. Now I'm going to name my input field. It's really important to give these parts of your HTML a name. So I'm going to call this one enter ID so that I can refer to it later. And we'll give it a type as well. Let's just say text for now. Doesn't want to go inside my quotes there, but there we go. So I'm going to do another couple of IDs with inputs. So I'm going to be a bit lazy here and just copy and paste. However, please be very careful when you're copying and pasting, that if you're going to copy and paste, you've got to change all the relevant bits that need changed. So I'm going to put a heading here that says name, and the ID for it is going to say enter name. So I'm going to call it enter name because that's the input field. This input HTML element here is the input field where I enter their name. So I think it's really important to have names or IDs for your elements that make a lot of sense. So don't just put random names here. Actually think of what actually makes sense for what the element is and what it represents. It does make things a lot easier later on. If your variable names, your ID names, etc., if they all do make sense. Okay, and then age is going to be my final heading, and obviously I'm going to call this one enter age. Nice logical system, but we'll make this not type equals text. We'll say this should be type equals number, because the age is going to be a number. Now underneath that I want some buttons, so let's give myself some space. Actually, I'm just going to put a couple of break elements in here. So BR is like a break element. It kind of takes it down a line or two to the next part of your HTML. And underneath all these input fields for ID, name, and age, I want the buttons. I want to click on buttons to do various things with the data. So the first one, I'm going to put it in big bold capital letters. I'm going to have a button that's called insert, or it has the text insert inside the button. And I'm going to name it. I need to give it an ID. So we'll call this one insert. Again, nice and simple names that make sense. And then I'm going to have another button that allows me to not just insert the data into the database, but I want one that allows me to update the data once it's already there. So update, and we'll make sure that that button has a big label on it that says update. Okay, and then last one is going to be remove. The last one for this div anyway, we'll call that remove. So giving each one an ID, because later with my JavaScript I'm going to want to grab these HTML elements and do something with them. So those are my buttons, and these are all my other the headings and the input variables up here. Now I don't like to go too far in coding before I actually stop. I save, and we want to actually test that this is working. So let's actually come to the desktop. What did I call it? My simple database. Here it is. Let's bring it out here. I'll open it up. Okay, and that's what it's looking like at the moment. So that's nice. I've got a space to enter the ID, the name, and age, and I've got the buttons to insert, update, or remove them from my database there. So that's exactly what I want. Okay, so now let's come to my next div. Come back here, and what I want with this div is I've got the find by ID heading, but obviously I need an input field for that as well. So let's put an H4 there for, and just call it ID, to sort of prompt the user to type in the ID that they're wanting to sort of search for in the database. Then we'll give them an input field, and this input field ID, we're going to, instead of enter ID, this one's going to be find ID. Okay, and we'll do type, we'll make that text as well, because we've got to make it match what we had up the top for ID. Alright, and then let's have a break or two to just move down, and after that we're going to have a button to allow us to click on that button to say, yep, we want to find it now. So we'll just type in the word find in bold capital letters, and I'm going to give this button an ID as well, and we'll call it find, which makes sense. Right, so it's just setting up the HTML here. Now after that, I'm actually not done. I want to put a couple of empty H3s here. So my H3s, I'm going to put a couple here, but they're going to have nothing in them. And the reason for this is that when I click the find button, I want something to go, I want to inject some data into these empty H3s. And it's going to be the data that I'm searching for from my database. We're going to put it into these H3s. We're going to put it onto the web page. But at the moment, we don't know what they're looking for. So we'll keep them empty. But we will give them an ID so that our JavaScript code can inject the data into these spaces in our web page later on when we want it to, when we want to click that button. Okay, so let's give it a good ID. So we'll make the top one a name. So this is where we're finding the name. That's going to be text. So type equals text. And let's do the same for the other h3. Let's make this, but this one's not the name. This is where we want to put the age. So in other words, we want to type in the ID of what we're trying to search for. We're going to click the find button, and then hopefully inside the HTML here, we're going to inject the name and the age of the person that we're going to try and find. Okay, all right. May as well have another. Just move it down a little bit. It's me being a bit pedantic. Okay, so again, let's just save this and see what it looks like. I always like to check that, because otherwise you can code for hours and go, oh, there's something went wrong ages ago. So it's important to check regularly. Okay, so that's what we want in terms of the HTML. It doesn't look good, so let's do some CSS. CSS helps things to look a bit better. This video is not focused on CSS, so I'm not going to do too much. But just in the head of my document here, I'm going to put a style tag. Again, you could make a separate CSS file, but for now, I'm wanting this to be a one-page web document. So let's just have some style tags up here. And to start with, for the entire body, for everything, I'm going to have a text align in the center. So that's going to apply to the entire body of the document. So that's everything between these body tags here, the opening and closing body tag. It's all going to be centered. So what that'll do is it will just bring everything into the middle like that. But I actually don't want these divs one on top of the other. I want them side by side. So I'm going to style my enter details div, this first div. And because it's an ID, I need to use the hashtag symbol. So hashtag enter details will allow me to style that first div by its ID. And I want to float both of these to the left. Float left sort of makes them sort of float up, and if it's left, then they both come alongside each other rather than being one on top of the other. So I'll do this for both of them. Float left, but I want them to take up half the page each. So we'll say width of each div is going to be 50%. I'm going to give each one a background color. So background color, it can be whatever you want. I quite like dark slate gray for the background color. And then for the color of the actual text, I'm going to make it floral white. These are my go-to favorites. So now that's the enter details div. And I'm going to copy and paste. Again, remember to be very careful with copying and pasting. I know I'm being lazy, but it is quicker. But so the second div was called find details, I think. Let's check that. Yep, find details. So I'm going to style that div. So hashtag find details. I want that to float to the left as well. That's also going to have a width of 50%. But to contrast them, what I'll do is I'll swap these colors around. So I'll make, for this one, the background can be floral white. And I'll make the color of the text here, I'll make that dark slate gray. Then we just got that nice contrast from one to the other, so we can tell the difference between the divs. Now the last thing I'm going to do here is just for the input fields. So for all my input fields, every single one, I'm going to style them all in the same way, and it's just to give them enough width. So I'm going to say width equals, let's make it 120 pixels. Just so there's enough room for people to enter their names. Okay, that should do it. So again, let's save that and check what it looks like. So when I refresh my page now, there we go, we've got some styling. Oh, it's a bit tight up there, so I might just put a couple more breaks in. Let's see. Yeah, after here I might just put a break or two in, just to make it look like it has a bit more space. Of course, all the stuff, you can play around with and get it looking the way you want. You might be doing something completely different, but just for demo purposes, that's what I want it to look like. All right, so two contrasting divs where I can enter the details that I want to be either inserted or updated or removed from the database, and then I can go and find by ID a particular bit of data from the database as well. Okay, so of course none of this does anything yet. It's just my HTML and my CSS. So now let's actually connect what I've done here to my actual Firebase database that I set up. And like I was referring to before, the way that I do that is I come here to this code here. So that's just in my project settings, that's how I'm finding it. In the project settings, I just scroll down and I click on CDN, and there I've got these script tags. I'm just going to copy that whole thing and paste it in underneath the HTML there, paste it in, and there's my script. Now, of course, you can have separate JavaScript files that are connected to your HTML, but for now, again, I'm keeping it nice and simple. We're just going to have a one-page document here. This is all the information that we sort of need, except there's more stuff that I need to do here. So what I'm going to do is just add a couple of things. Firstly, I've got my app initialized here, so that's good. I need that code there for initializing the app. But there's some other methods or sort of functions from the Firebase library that I'm going to want to use later on, and it's great that Firebase has all these tools for us, but I do need to actually import them. So I'm going to use the keyword import, and then in my fancy brackets, I'm going to import the things that I need. So the first method that I really need is one called getDatabase. Let me spell it right, otherwise it won't work. So getDatabase, that's going to allow me to get my database from where I've created it. So obviously I can't do anything with the data unless I get it, initialize it, and say, yep, here it is. So that's important. And then I'm going to use all the methods for setting. If I want to put data into the database, so that's called set in Firebase. So I'm going to set data into the database. That's important. Then I might want to get data from the database once it's in there. So set, get. I want to update data possibly. So I'm going to use the update method. I need to import that in from Firebase. I may want to remove data once I've put it in there, delete it. So those methods are all really important for me to import. There's another couple that I need though. One is this one here called ref. So that allows me to get a specific reference in my database, or to put data in with a specific reference. So being really precise about exactly where in the database I want to put data, or where in the database I want to get data from. So we're not going to have a terribly complicated structure to this database. Again, we're trying to keep it as simple as possible, but we are still going to have a couple of scenarios where we want to refer to a specific part of the database. So that's what ref is for. And then just in the same way, we might have like a parent-child situation. So we're going to import the child method so that we can say, yeah, if there's a broader kind of folder, as it were, for data, we want to go to one specific part, one sort of like a child part of within that data, if that makes sense. So we're going to import all these methods, but where are we going to import them from? So import from, use the keyword from. Where are we getting these from? We're getting them from the same URL here that we initialized the app from in the first place. This is Firebase itself with the current version and everything up there. So that's the URL that I want to import all of this from, except that there's a really important difference, and it's not Firebase app. It's not that library we're talking about. We're looking at getting these tools from Firebase database. That's the library that we're getting it from. So just change that URL to database, and then we can import all of the stuff from the Firebase library, which is great. Okay, so that should hopefully allow us now to be connected to the database that we created in Firebase. But we actually haven't written any JavaScript code yet ourselves, and that's the really important bit. So this is what we're going to focus on now, is actually writing some code that works to do something with our database and to do something with our HTML. Okay, so firstly, and it's a bit boring, but we have to do it, we need to create a whole lot of variables and initialize all our variables. The first and probably the most important one, I'm going to use the constant, const to declare this variable. We're just going to call it DB, short for database. And what that variable will do is it'll call the getDatabase method that we've just imported from Firebase. Don't forget the empty parentheses there. Okay, so we need to actually get the database from where we've created it. So we're going to store that in a variable. That's important. But then we've got all these elements here from our HTML that have these particular IDs. Well, I want to create variables for each of these so that I can actually do things with these, with my JavaScript. Okay, so first one is where we actually enter the ID name. So I'm going to create a variable called enter ID. What I'm going to store in this variable is, something from the document. So the document is everything between the opening and the closing HTML tags. I'm talking about my entire document. But I'm interested in this bit firstly. This is where the person is entering the ID number of whatever data they're adding. And I've given it a name here, which is enter ID. And for me personally, I find it easier to name the variables the exact same thing that the ID is in the HTML. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to find this element by its ID from the document. So there's a couple of ways I could do this, but I prefer the query selector method. So I'm going to say document.querySelector, and that will find something from my HTML for me. What I'm going to find, I'll put it in brackets, and then I need the string quotes. And because it's by ID, and I'm using the query selector method, again, just like with the CSS, I need to use the hashtag to find the ID. So hashtag enter ID, and from now on, that element is going to be stored in this enter ID variable. Okay, now a bit laborious, but I'm going to do the same thing again for all of these different elements, all of the important elements that I want. I'm going to use a semicolon to end each instruction. Now, enter ID, I've also got one called enter. Oh, what did I do there? Pressed the wrong button, is what I did. Okay, enter name. And again, if you're copying and pasting, be very, very careful to make sure you're changing everything that you need to. But I'm going to query the enter name ID from my HTML and grab that and store it in the enter name variable. And then I'm going to do the same thing, but for enter age, being very careful that all the capital letters are in the right place when I'm referring to things by ID. It has to be spelled exactly the same way. Another really common error is to forget this hashtag. If you forget that hashtag, it won't know what you're talking about if you're using the query selector method. So be careful of that as well. Okay, and then after all the entering ones, I had the find ID input. So, when I'm on the other div and I'm wanting to find something by ID, I had an input field for that, and I called that find ID. So we're storing that in a variable. And then I'm going to do the same for find name. Now, find name is not an input field. If you remember, I'll create a variable called find name, but the find name ID here, remember that's our empty h3 up here. So that's this element that I'm grabbing now. It's that empty h3, and I want to use that later, so I'm creating this variable because I want to be able to inject some data into that space from my HTML, that empty h3 space. So find name, and then we had find age as well, and that's where the age bit is going to go. So find age, and that's going to be the part of my HTML that's got the ID find age. So some people might find it confusing that I've got the same variable name as the ID names. And it's up to you. You could make these different. Personally, just for some reason for me, I find it easier to keep them the same because it just keeps things nice and organized in my head. But if the double up confuses you, then just keep them different. As long as you're in control, that's the most important thing. Just always be in control. Okay, I've got more variables to declare because I made all these buttons. And I want each button to be able to be used by a variable as well. So actually I might break from my rule here. This is called insert, but I think I want to give it a variable name that distinguishes between the buttons and the other ones. So I'm going to call this one insert, but I'm just going to add camel case btn there as well, just to indicate that it's a button. And that's going to be in my document. I'm going to use the query selector method, and I called this one, so remember the hashtag, you got to remember the hashtag for it because it's an ID. I called that insert, and again I'll just copy this and paste it, being slightly lazy. Had the insert button, but there was another button that I called update. So that's my update button, but that ID was update. So many variables, but it is very important. This is the structure, right? We've got to structure it right and have all the variables named correctly. Remove, we had a remove button, and that had the ID remove. Okay, and then the find button on the other side, on the other div, we had this find button, which, and the ID for that was find, so I use hashtag find. Okay, so now that I've declared all of these variables, that's great, but I need some functions. Okay, so when I click these buttons, when I click insert, I want a function to run. Okay, so I'm going to use the keyword function to declare my function, and I'm going to call this first one insert data, empty parentheses, and then the fancy brackets. Okay, that's the syntax for writing a function. Keyword function, name the function, empty parentheses, they don't have to be empty, you can put parameters in there, and then the fancy brackets, that's your block of code, and the code for the function goes in here, as we know. So I'm going to have 4 of these functions because there's 4 things I want to do. I want to insert data, then I also want to find data. Okay, I want to update data as well. So if data's already in there but I want to change it, so I'm going to do the update data function. And then the last one is I want to be able to remove data as well. So I've got buttons that do those things, or that are supposed to do those things. So remove data, update, find, and insert data. And I've got variable names now for each of those buttons, because each variable name refers to that button from the HTML that I've given an ID to. But if I click on a button at the moment, the computer doesn't know that I've clicked on the button. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use these variables here to add an event listener. And so that's exactly what it sounds like. The computer's listening out for the event of me, the user, clicking on that button. So let's start with the insert button. So I'm going to find this insert button by using the variable that I've created, which grabs it from my document. And I'm going to use dot to add the method dot add event listener. And that add event listener method allows me to listen out for an event. Of course, the computer doesn't have ears, it's not actually listening, but I can name the event that I want it to sort of wait for, as it were. So in quotes, I'm going to put click, because it's when I click the button, that's the event that I'm talking about. That's the big event. It's me clicking the button. Okay, and then after a comma, I'm going to write the name of the function that I want to run when that event happens. And because it's my insert button, the function that I want to run is the insert data function. Okay? Alright, so I'm going to do this a few times, so forgive me copying and pasting again. Let's do the same thing here, but instead of the insert button, we're going to do the next one here with the update button. I'm going to add an event listener to that, but obviously I don't want the insert data function to run when I click the update button. I want the update data function to be called when the event of me clicking the update button happens. Okay, and then again for remove. So if I click the remove button, I want the remove data function to run. These are sort of slightly in the wrong order, but never mind. And then the last one, find. When I click the find button, then I want the find data function to be called or to run. All right? Okay, great. So this is the structure of it now. I've got all my variables defined, I've got all my functions declared, and I've got the event listeners so that the computer knows when I'm clicking on each of these buttons, and I've named which function I want to be called when each particular button is clicked on. So let's actually write some functions. This is the fun bit, this is the cool bit. So when I want to insert data, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the set method that I've imported from Firebase to sort of set or put in the data into the database. So inside the set function here, or method, or whatever we call it, I'm going to put a data structure in here. So I'm going to put the fancy brackets in there for the data that I want to put in. And I'm going to put in the person's name. So name, colon, so what's the name? Where am I going to get this name from? So I'm going to get it from up here where they have typed something in. So they have typed in the person's name into this input field here that I've called enter name. Now I've got a variable for that as well. So that element from my HTML is called enter name, but it's not the input HTML element that I want. It's the value of whatever the person types in. Okay, so if we can just distinguish between that, let me just show you what I mean. If I come back to my code here, my web page, when the person types in their name, if they type in Mr. Patterson or whatever, it's not this input element that I want, it's the value of what I'm actually typing. So for me to get the value of what's actually typed into that input field, it's really important that I use the .value method here, so that I'm getting the actual, the content of what's been put into that input field. And I'm going to store that beside, name, and then I'm going to do the same for ID. And that's going to be the enter ID input field, and .value to get the value of whatever the person has typed into that enter ID field. And then beside age, I'm going to grab the enter age element from my HTML, and I'm going to grab the value of whatever the user is typing into that. Okay. So that's my data structure there, and I'm going to set that into my database. But whereabouts in the database? So let's come here, and I'm going to use the ref method here. Okay. And so inside these brackets, and it's complaining here, the reason it's complaining is because I just need a comma here between my ref function and the data that I'm wanting to put in. So I'm setting, or in other words, sort of putting into the database all of this data that I've grabbed from my web page, from whatever the user has put in there. But I want to give it a specific reference to exactly where I'm putting it into my database. Okay, and where that is, well, it's in my database. So let's not forget to use that DB variable. Remember, I got I made this constant here, this DB. So I'm using the get database method from Firebase to say, yeah, I've created this database. Let's actually get it. Let's refer to that. So I'm referring to the database as a whole. But then after a comma, I can be a bit more specific about it. And what I want to do is I want to create like a bit of an overarching, kind of like you could think of it as a folder. And I'm going to just call this people. It's sort of the general name. So people, this is where everyone goes in. So people / because it's kind of like a folder to begin with. And then slightly more specifically after that, each person is going to have their own ID. So they're going to have their name and their age, but that's going to be nested under their ID. So inside this people folder, I want a list of IDs with their name and age and ID with it. So I'm going to get that enter ID .value, because people are going to type in an ID into that space. So again, it's what I type in here. So if I type in 01, for example, that's going to be the value of my ID input field, and that value there is going to go as a sort of a reference point in my database for where I'm storing all the rest of this data, their name and their age, etc. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. It'll be easier to see what that means when you actually see it going into the database. I'll show you in a second. But I'm not done yet, because I don't just want the data to go into the database. For the sake of usability, I also want people to be able to get that confirmation message saying, yeah, it's worked. So we're going to go .then, use the .then method. And inside our .then brackets, we're just going to use an arrow function. So arrow function, I sort of think of these as being like, let's cut to the chase. So I've got the empty parentheses followed by the arrow, and then we're going to cut to the chase straight to the block of code that I want to run. So that's just going to be an alert. So we'll get our success message popping up. So an alert, and inside the parentheses we'll have in quotes for the message that we want. Let's just say data added successfully. Let's throw an exclamation mark in there. Let's give people some endorphins when it works. All right, that's cool, but you know, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it does go wrong. So we need to have, let's use .catch for catching any errors. So the .catch method in here. Again, we're going to go use an arrow function here, and in the fancy brackets here for, you know, again, I see the arrows kind of cutting to the chase. Again, we're going to have an alert. So what we'll put in this alert, actually even before that, we're going to come up here and we're going to catch the error. So if there is an error, we'll put that in as a parameter here. We're just going to throw up an alert that just tells us what it's complaining about. So whatever is on the computer's mind, if it's got an issue, we'll say, yeah, all right, just pop up an alert, and you tell us what that issue is. You pop that into the alert there, and then we'll hopefully, if what you say, Mr. Computer, makes sense, or Mrs. Computer, then we will hopefully be able to read that error and do something about it. But the idea is that hopefully those errors don't happen. All right, okay, so that is the insert data function, but oh my goodness, this is the moment of truth. Let's see if it actually works. So I don't like to go too far without testing things out. So let's save that, and then let's come up here and refresh this. Okay, let's actually give it a go. So I'm going to use 01 as my ID. The name is Mr. Patterson, and you already know that I'm 21. And I click insert, and thank goodness, there are the endorphins, data added successfully. Do I believe it? Well, let's find out. Let's come to my database here. So let's go to the Realtime database, and hopefully, yeah, there we go. We can see it's changed. We've got this people sort of folder here, and if I expand on that, I've got that ID, and then within that, there I've got all the data. Maybe I need the ID again. I decided to do it that way, but I've got the name and the age, and then the ID repeated inside the sort of the ID folder, which is inside the people folder. And so I've set it up that way. So that's great. Okay, awesome, it's working. Lovely. Okay, so then let's come to our find data function. So with the find data function, we're not just finding the entire database, we're finding specific data from particular parts of the database. So I'm just going to throw in another variable here, a constant. I'm going to put it inside the function. And this is just going to help with the syntax a little bit. And I'm going to call it dbref, just to indicate that I'm talking about a specific reference from the database. And this will help things to be a little bit less nested and a little bit more straightforward from here on in. So this dbref variable, I'm going to use the ref method or function from what I've imported from Firebase. And I'm just going to put db, that db variable that I made before. So I'm going to get the database. Sure, I'm going to get the database, but I'm looking for a specific reference within my database. And I'm going to store all of that in this dbref variable, semicolon that. Just doing that step's just going to make the syntax a bit easier for what we want to do next. Because what we're doing is we're getting data from the database that's already there. So I'm going to use the get method that we've imported from Firebase. So get, and inside get, I'm immediately going to use another method because I'm actually wanting to get a child of, a parent folder of the data. So I've got the people folder, and then I've got each ID has got its own sort of space in the database as well. So I'm going to want to get a child from each ID. So I'm going to use the child function that I've imported from the Firebase library as well. So child, and then in the parentheses, they're not going to be kept empty. I'm going to use this dbref variable to say, yep, I'm wanting a specific reference from my database, and then a comma, and after the comma, I'm going to actually name what that specific reference is. So in string quotes, I'm going to type in people with the / because that's my sort of overarching folder of where the data is. And then plus, I'm going to add the plus to, what I want, the specific part of the database that I want, well, I don't know yet. It depends whatever the user types in, right? So just to remind you, the user is going to type something into this field here. So I've given this field an ID, and I've stored that in a variable, and I've called it find ID. So find ID, that's going to grab that input field from my HTML, but remember I need .value to grab whatever they type in. So if they type in 01, it's going to grab that value from that input field. And then it's going to grab that as a child from the database of like, yeah, that, a child from within that of what I want to find from that part of my database, whether it's their name or the age, but it's going to pertain to that particular ID that they've typed into that input field. Okay, so now that I've got this, specific reference of where I want to be in the database, let's use .then function, and inside the parentheses of .then, I'm going to actually grab a snapshot of the database as it is right now, because it needs to be current, right? So in brackets here, I'm going to put snapshot inside my brackets, and then I'm going to use an arrow function, cut straight to the chase of, in fancy brackets there. What I want inside my brackets is, well, it depends really. Okay, if this ID that the person's typed in, if it exists, then obviously I want to show them that data, the person's name and the person's age. But if it doesn't exist, then I want it to pop up with a message that says, hey, there's no data of that ID in my database. So I'm going to use an if statement for this. So the way an if statement works, as you know, is we have if, and then in brackets we have the condition that is either met or not met, and after that we have a block of code that runs if that condition is met or if it's true. So the condition that I want to know whether it's true or not is whether the snapshot that I've grabbed from the database, in particular, the ID that I've typed in, does that exist or not? So if it exists, and I use exists method here, so snapshot.exists, and then the empty parentheses there, I'll leave those empty. If it's true that the snapshot of that particular ID, that it exists, then I'm going to put the name and the age of that person on my web page. Now remember, I've got these empty H3s here, and I've named them find name and find age, because I'm finding things from the database. Now I want to put those up on the web page if they're there. So I'm going to grab this, firstly, this find name element, that's my empty HTML, but I'm going to inject some HTML in there. So I'm going to use .innerHTML method. So I'm going to put in the HTML. Well, what am I going to put in? I'm going to put the value of that database snapshot for that particular ID. So I'm going to put in snapshot.val, because that's going to give me the value. So .val, it's a method, so I'll use the empty brackets there. And then .name with a capital letter, because I want to grab the name. Again, this is the child that I'm grabbing, is the person's name from that particular ID section of my database. So I want to put this data from my database into the HTML, that empty H3 there. The inner HTML of that is now going to be the value of that person's name from my database that I put in. And just so that no one gets confused, let's also add a string that just says name and then a colon. We'll give it a space, and then let's concatenate. So I'll use the plus symbol to concatenate this string of their name, plus let's grab the actual snapshot of the person's name with that ID from my database. Okay, so again, careful when I'm copying and pasting, but basically I want pretty much the same thing underneath that, but I'm just going to use the find age element from my HTML. That's the empty H3 that's reserved for the person's age, and I'll just change this to a string that says age, and then I'll grab the snapshot, the value from my database of the person's age, which is the child data from that particular ID, if that makes sense. Now that's all very well if it works, but there's two reasons why it might not. Firstly, there might not be data underneath that particular ID value in the database. So I'm going to put my else statement in there, and then the block of code for my else statement. So if it's not true that snapshot exists, I'm going to have an alert that just says no data found, which means it's not there. Okay, but there might also be some other error. The computer might complain, for some other reason. And if that's the case, then what we're going to do is we're just going to say .catch, use the .catch method. And if there is, let's use an arrow function, cut straight to the chase, and we'll put an alert in here. Okay, so as a parameter for this arrow function, we'll say, if the computer has some error, something it wants to complain about, we'll put that in there as a parameter, and then we will put an alert up with whatever the computer's issue is. So we'll put that in the alert, just like we did before. Okay, great. So that should hopefully be the find data function, but we're never quite sure unless we try it out. So I'm going to save the code there. I'm going to come up here and let's refresh. And let's see if this actually works. So I'm going to type in the 01 ID, which is the only bit of data I've put in there so far. And I'm going to click the find button. And there we go, there's my name and there's my age showing up in those. They were empty H3s, but now they're full with the data that I've got from the database. Hooray, awesome, brilliant. Yes, this is working, fabulous, lovely. But what if I want to change my name or something like that? What if I don't want to be called Mr. Patterson anymore, or I want 01 to represent somebody else? Well, if that's the case, then I'm going to use, again, I imported it from Firebase. I've got this update function that is specifically for exactly that. Okay, and straight away inside the parameters here, inside the brackets, I'm going to use the ref function again that I imported from Firebase. And once again, the reference, I need to have a specific part of the database that I'm referring to, because the database needs to know what is the specific part that I'm wanting to update. Okay, so obviously it's from my database somewhere, so I use DB to say, yep, let's get the database. And within that, again, it's the string capital letter people and / plus, and then just the same as we did before, it's that enter ID part of the HTML dot value. Now let me just explain this. If someone's going to update, what they're going to do is they're going to need to put the ID that they want to update in there first. So before anyone clicks this update button, which calls the update function that I'm writing now, we need to have something in this field here, because we need to tell the database exactly which part of it we want to update. So that's what's happening here. Whatever is in that enter ID input field, the value of that, whatever the number the person is that they've typed in, that's the part of the database that we're going to update. Okay, so we're using the ref method to say, yep, that's the specific reference for the particular part of the database that we want to update. Okay, and then a comma, and then we've actually got our block of code here. So this is what we want to do. We want to get the name. If someone's typed in a new name, they're going to put it into that enter name input field. And again, we want to grab the value. So dot value. So enter name dot value, comma, and let's have age with a colon. And again, we're grabbing the enter age input field and we're grabbing the value of whatever the person has typed in there. Okay. All right. So once that's done, it means that we know the part of the database that we want to update, and we know the values of what we want to update them with. But we need that success message. So hopefully it's gone through the database and updated it. But we're going to go .then and use that method. And then we're going to use our arrow function, so the empty parentheses and then the arrow and then our block of code. And what we're going to want to have is our alert, which let's make this one say data updated successfully. And let's throw that exclamation mark in there because we need to feel good. If it doesn't work, semicolon, don't forget. We're going to use the .catch function one more time. And then we're familiar with this now. We've done it before. We've got our arrow function here. And the code that will run if there is an error is an alert that will show that error. So we'll put the error in here as a parameter. And if there is an error, it's going to show it as the alert, hopefully. All right, let's semicolon that as well. Why not? Actually, let's semicolon that as well. It's always, you just got to throw the semicolons in there with JavaScript. Okay, so let's save that and let's see if this works. Hopefully it does. I'll refresh my browser here. So I'm going to come to my ID up here. I'm going to say, okay, 01, it was Mr. Patterson, but I'm going to call myself James from now on. And maybe you know what? Maybe I'm actually 23. Okay. So now I'm going to click update, and yay, data updated successfully with a question, with an exclamation point to give me extra endorphins. But now let's test this out over here. So now if I type in 01 and click find, yep, it actually finds it from the database. I can also check that out here in Firebase. In fact, it's already updated there. So you can see that person number 01, it's updated to be James with the age 23. So that's gone straight to my Firebase database. So, you know, that's what's happening. When I enter these things in and click these buttons, it's actually sending that data to my Firebase database. So that's awesome. And there's just one thing now that's left to do, and that is to write my function for removing the data. And once again, thanks to Firebase, we've got these built-in methods. So remove, and that's what it's going to do. It's going to remove the data from my database. Once again, exactly the same thing though. We need a specific reference for the part of the database that we're wanting to remove. So we make this, we call this reference function. And what is it that what is the reference? Well, it's from my database. So DB and then comma. Once again, we've got this, you know, it's the people / don't forget the capital letter. Plus, and once again, we would expect them to have typed something into that enter ID input field. Remember, I've made the variable name for that input field where they enter the ID. But .value, because it's the value of whatever they type in there that counts. Okay, we'll use our .then function again. So .then, and inside that once more we will have our arrow function. And the block of code will be our success message. So again, that's just going to be an alert that says, well, this one will say data removed successfully. Okay, we'll semicolon that one. And then once again, in case it doesn't work, we'll just have .catch method, and then we'll pass in the parameter, the error, sorry, as a parameter, and then our arrow function and our block of code, which again will just be an alert that will show us what the error is. Hopefully there aren't any errors, but that should cover us if there are. Always important. And we'll semicolon that, why not? Okay, so I'm going to save this, and once again, let's check that that works. So refresh my browser, and I'm actually going to delete myself. So 01, I don't need to type in anything else. It should know what I mean with that 01 ID. I click remove, and nothing happens. Oh no, I was so close to getting to the end here, but what is going on? I'm going to inspect the console. Enter ID is not defined, but I thought I defined it. I thought I defined enter ID, but of course, when I defined enter ID, I used a capital D. And down here, I have said enter ID with a lowercase d. So JavaScript, it needs everything, you know, to be exactly the same. So enter ID, that's the name of my variable, and I essentially spelt it wrong. So it needs a capital D there. So right, so let me save that and refresh, and let's do that again. Let's get rid of this. Okay, so I'm going to try and delete myself again. 01 is the ID. I click remove. Now it says data removed successfully. And if I try and find the 01 ID, it says no data found because I'm gone. I'm not there anymore, and I can confirm that with if I go into Firebase, it's gone. It's not there anymore. But no worries, I can always put myself back. You know what? I'm going to call myself John this time, and I'll be in the middle. I'll be 22 this time. I'll insert that data. That's there. And so now, if I try and find 01, it will find John, and I am 22. All right. So that is basic functions of using an HTML page that's connected to a Firebase database. Obviously, what you can do from now on is you can take this simple starting point and use it to create your own web pages that are connected to a database and do all sorts of other things with it. So have some fun, be creative, use these skills and do all sorts of awesome things.